We are here today with Lee McFall. We're in Sparta at Mr. McFall's dental office, and would like to first ask if you have read and signed the legal release.
Yes, I have.
Okay, thank you. And the project is, the interview is being conducted for the White Lake Environmental History Project, and it would be helpful to start with a question as to what's your relationship to the White Lake area?
Well, when I was a little boy, we had a cottage on the north side of White Lake, across the street from the Hooker Chemical Company. That was my grandfather's property, really. I'm not sure how big a piece it is, but it's probably 300 feet wide by a quarter of a mile long from Old Channel Trail down to the water. And my grandfather had his home there, and then he built a cottage down on the water for my parents as a wedding present in 1949. And so that was our cottage, and we spent most of our summers there from, say, 1950 but I was born in 1952. My sister was born in 50, and we spent our summers there until 1965.
Well, what was your grandfather's name?
Everybody called him T.E. because those were his initials. It's Thurlow Edwin McFall, and most people called him Mac, actually. So, but T.E. was another name that they called him a lot.
And your grandmother?
Henrietta, and she was also a huge part of the family lore because she was a very interesting character. But they owned that property there. And that's where they lived while I was a little boy. They lived in Muskegon for a while, and they lived in Sparta for a while. But when I thought of my grandparents' house, I thought about the house on what is now called McFall Circle.
Can you tell me a little bit about your parents, their names and background a little bit?
Okay, my dad's name is Paul. He doesn't have a first name, just an initial H, which was for his mother, Henrietta. So it's H. Paul McFall, and then he married my mom, Shirley Faulkner, and then she became, of course, Shirley McFall. And they married in ⁴, and my sister was born in 1950. So my sister was born 9 months to the day after they got married. And and then I was born in ⁵2. And he didn't have any other siblings. He was an only child.
So your grandparents had property on White Lake?
Yes.
And then your parents and you lived on White Lake for a time?
We were there for the summers, pretty much for the entire summer.
Okay. Do you, can you tell a little bit about your memories of White Lake as a boy?
Well, of course, it's my favorite memories, actually, was because that's where I felt like I grew up, Went to school here, but that's where I had all my fun and all my summers. So, and my grandfather, when he was alive, but he died in, I think it was 1959. I was only 6, 7, 8 years old when he died, so I didn't know him that well, but I do remember him. He's a very interesting man that had many skills, had many inventions in his lifetime. And then on the hill that goes down to the lake, he tiered that off and made gardens, vegetable gardens and fruit gardens, and he was a master at it. And even now there are blueberry, he put the blueberries in these massive pots that he buried so he could keep the water level at a certain level and grow really big blueberries. Those pots, I'm sure, are still buried there. And he was an environmentalist, and that was one of the main things that I remember about my grandfather, is that he also had a very large log cabin in the woods in Baldwin. And when we would go up there, and if we hunted, if we fished, it was all by the book, and it was all done as if you were the hunter and there was the prey. But he was a very big into environmental issues, catch and release, even way back in the 1950s. Keep what you want to eat, but release everything else. So I remember that very distinctly about my grandfather.
Do you know if he expressed any viewpoints to your parents or anything like that?
I don't know. I have read now these articles that were sent to me from the Montague, is it called the Montague?
Probably the Montague Observer.
Of the Observer, yes, that's right. All the articles that were written about Hooker coming in and the mentions of my grandfather here and there, because he started a group called the White Lake Improvement Association, which was 13 property owners to fight Hooker. Of course, he had the most to lose because Hooker had purchased the property, which was Dowie Point, the old Dowie property, which was purchased from Dowie by Struven. So Struven actually owned the property that was right next to his, that included Dowie Point. And so he had the most to lose if there was going to be a factory built right next to his home on the bluff and our cottage down there. So he started the White Lake Improvement Association, which was 13 land property owners. And I'm sure his main concern, of course, was the value of his property, and so were the other ones. But he also, I know, was thinking about the environment because I just know who he is. And there was one quote where he said they wanted to make sure that the lake stayed good for boating and fishing and recreation. So I'm sure that's what he's thinking of was the environmental impact.
So you've read the articles about what your grandfather did in relation to Hooker, and you know, we've heard a lot in our interviews about how, you know, excited and pleased people were to have Hooker Chemical and the other chemical companies come. I imagine it was difficult for your grandfather to push his case.
Yes, and you could tell from all the articles that he was ostracized by the community because almost everyone wanted it. And so he was the one who started the lawsuit that ended up being heard in, I think, down in Muskegon County Circuit Court. And I don't know, I can't say as he actually won the lawsuit. They started out trying to fight it from a zoning aspect. That got thrown out. So then I'm not sure what angle he used, but he was fighting it in circuit court, and with the other landowners, I'm sure that they all were pitching in for the attorney fees and everything like that. And according to the articles written in the Observer, which are written by people who were opposed to what my grandfather was doing, it was fun actually. I would laugh sometimes to read it when they'd say McFall and his group of cohorts and things like that. Hooker apparently conceded without actually losing any kind of a lawsuit to building across the road, because if they decided to fight it, it would end up going for years before it got settled. So they made a compromise, and the compromise was agreed upon by my grandfather and the Improvement Association. And so that when it just got the fire to rolling, and the ball got rolling, and they started building pretty much immediately. But they did drill on the Dowie property down by the lake. They had to go a half a mile down to find that salt, but they found the salt that they needed. So they had signed some sort of an agreement to purchase the property if contingent upon finding the salt, and they did find the salt. Unfortunately, they found the salt.
Was it the main goal of the Improvement Association and grandfather to stop them, or was it to move them? Was the move across the street kind of a compromise that both agreed to?
Yes, it was a compromise on both parts. They were trying to stop them. They were trying to stop them completely. And you can imagine, if you were a business person in the community, that you would want somebody that's going to come in and have potentially. I don't remember how many people ended up working there. I never read that, but when they talked about Niagara Falls, which I think, didn't that end up being Love Canal? Or
well,
didn't it?
The Hooker Chemical Company was responsible for Love Canal. Yeah.
So, and then over in Washington, they were talking about thousands of jobs. So, potentially hundreds of jobs for Montague would make a huge difference, I'm sure. And to read the articles in the Observer where the townspeople the Chamber of Commerce sent representatives out to Niagara Falls to look at the factory there. And when they came back, what they said, which was, you know, in today's, it's naive today, but then they didn't know as much about pollution as we know about today. So you have to give them a little bit of credit. I mean, I don't think Hooker was out to pollute it, but right from 1950, and a lot of that was unknown, I think. But anyway, I'm trying to give them a little bit of a break. But anyway, when they would come back and they would say that the air still smelled sweet, the flowers were blooming, so you could tell they were thinking about pollution it's sort of subtle, but you can read through the lines, and you can tell there were concerns about pollution, but they were coming back and saying that, you know, everybody was healthy and the trees looked great and the well-kept lawn and the inside of the facilities were spotless and things like that. So you can tell that they were thinking about the pollution, about wondering about whether or not there was going to be a problem, or maybe that was something that my grandfather brought up to them. They were actually sort of answering that by saying everything looked clean and everything out there.
Well, and I'm guessing that your grandfather probably didn't trust that information.
I would guess not. He was a very, very savvy businessman. I mean, right here in Sparta, he was president of the Muskegon Piston Ring, president of Extensile Furniture Company, which he started, and president of the bank, Sparta State Bank, which is now Choice One, all at the same time. And he ran away from home when he was 13. He was a very savvy person. And so I know that he was definitely worried about that environmental. He wouldn't have probably called it that, but he would have said, you know, the pollution and things like that. He would have been very concerned about that.
So he was self-taught. Do you know anything else about his background?
Oh, well, you know, I know that his mother was abusive, and that's why he left. So he left when he was 13. And he was in the armed service. I think he was in the Air Force and the Navy. In the Navy, he learned the foundry business. And then he was in Hastings when the Sparta people up here, it was back when, in the say like around 1920, 1925, where every single community had a foundry to take care of any of the problems that the farmers had. They had to be able to make a piece of metal equipment or repair parts for them. They called him up because they had some problems and they wanted him to look things over, and he decided to stay. So then he really helped them. He relocated them, he built it up, and then Muskegon Piston Ring bought him out, and he was ended up being the president of this branch of the Muskegon Piston Ring. And I think that's probably why he lived in Muskegon for a while, to be closer to the brass over there. So yeah, and then he was a master gardener when in the Depression. He started a community garden, showed everybody how to garden so that nobody went hungry. And now I'm 61, but when I was maybe 30, 35, I had people coming into my office that were in their 80s and things, and telling them that they felt my grandfather had saved their family's life by just the food that they got from that garden. Wow. So, you know, he was a very, very interesting man, very good hunter, very good fisherman, taught me how to fish, got me interested in music, which is my hobby now. And so he was a good musician, and he was just a Renaissance man of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, I guess you'd call him. So
he and others in the White Lake Improvement Association pushed their case.
Yes.
And
in the courts.
And in a way, at least won a somewhat of a victory.
Yes. Yep.
And do you know what happened after that?
Right. The articles go silent. I mean, as soon as it kind of gets up to the point where they get the right to get that property, and then they talk about drilling the wells to check for salt, and they found the salt. And then all of the different little things in the Improvement Association was kind of like out of it by then, and the articles are being written about getting rights to cross people's land and buy property to get the railroad tracks up there from downtown Montague. So I don't really know what happened after that. And I was a baby, and I don't even know what year the actual hooker was built. I'm assuming it was 53, but I'm just
or possibly 54.
yes, but because it was supposed to be a big building, right? I mean, like a multi-million-dollar or at least $1 or $2 million project, which in today's money would be huge. And so there we were visiting our property, but I was a baby. They were probably building the plant.
Did your parents talk about what your grandfather did at all as you were growing up?
Only the fact that that they would point to the building across there, and they would say they were going to build right on the edge of the lake, on the bluff. One of the articles that are in the Observer actually had a drawing of what that was going to look like up there. And it's like, oh my gosh, they had smokestacks and everything. It's like, can you imagine what that would have been? What an eyesore that would have been.
Well, certainly a change for the community.
Yes.
And especially, I think, for people who summered in the area. I know one of the viewpoints that's come across a little bit is that there certainly was a difference between the viewpoints of summer people versus people who lived in the community.
Yes, and there's talk about people from Chicago who got on board with the White Lake Improvement Association because they were just summer visitors or whatever you want to call them, and they definitely were trying to also keep them from coming in. And I can remember that that property that's right next to what I call our property. It isn't our property anymore, but that was between us and then Dowie Point. I used to just play on that property all the time and explore. I'd go out there and just look around, and there were remnants of Dowie. There's a stairwell, and I guess they're improving that property now. Occidental Petroleum is improving that property.
They actually are part of a lake-wide effort aimed at shoreline restoration.
Yes.
And so their parcel, their shoreline parcel, is part of that, and just was completed last year. So some extensive changes to that shoreline property, but there's definitely a distinct advantage to having that shoreline property not built on. From an environmental perspective.
Yes.
It's actually considered, one of the better habitat areas around the lake.
Yes. But I remember going over there and getting close to places where there were fences, and it said, keep out, and hooker chemical, and these big, huge, massive pipes with the big wheels on them, and the hum that was coming through there, which I'm assuming was probably the water or the waste coming through there and going out into the lake off of Dowie Point, off the east side of Dowie Point.
Do you recall, you didn't live there, beyond maybe when you were 7 or so.
Right.
But do you...
No, when we were done in 65. Okay. So I was 13.
Oh, okay.
So I was 13 when we sold the cottage.
Do you recall hearing at all about pollution of White Lake and relating it all to your knowledge of your family history there?
No, after we left, and then there was high school for me, and then college, and then dental school, and I just kind of lost track of White Lake. I did not hear news, and it was before computers, so there wasn't any internet, there wasn't anything like that, so whatever, the Grand Rapids Press, but then I spent 4 years in Ann Arbor. I didn't get a newspaper there. I didn't have enough time to read a newspaper. I was reading my dental book, so I really lost track of what was really happening in White Lake. So no, after 65, I don't know much about what had happened there. Like the whistleblower that happened in the 70s and that, I never heard anything about that.
Do you want to go into detail a little bit more about the, what you did on White Lake as a young boy?
Most of the time we just played in the water. I mean, we either water skied or sailed. My dad bought a catamaran in 1962, and it was the first registered catamaran in the state of Michigan. So we did a lot of that, but we fished but mostly we swam in that lake. We were just water bugs, and I got a snorkel somehow and a mask. I don't remember how, but that piqued my interest, and now I still scuba dive. And I spent a lot of time in the water. So after I did hear that there was, a pollution problem, then I started worrying about myself, about as much time as I spent in the water, because of all of my family and friends and everybody that visited there was no way to spend as much time in the water as I did. I think I even spent more time than the Luttrells did, and they lived there. Of course, they lived there, so it wasn't so special for them, but it was for us. But when 65, that's when I think thereabouts, or the next year or two, that's when they subdivided the land, and they put the road in, if you want to call it that, the subdivision road in there, and divided it into lots and sold the lots. And the last, as I remember my mother or my father telling me, the last couple of lots out by Old Channel Trail did not sell because before they sold, they drilled, they checked the wells, and they were polluted. And that was the first time I ever heard of the pollution, which would have been, either late 60s, maybe early 70s. And now that I look back on that, I think about how fast that happened in time, because if they built the plant in, say, 54, it only took 16 years to get the pollution into the wells on our property. So that didn't take long.
No, and I'm wondering if that also coincides with the Blueberry Ridge neighbors, and also G.W. Carroll, who had lived in that area and had contaminated wells. So your grandfather sold the property, and it was subdivided, and it's now McFall Circle on a subdivision.
Yeah, my grandfather died in 59, I think, and then we hung on there for a while, and then my grandmother moved to the cabin in the woods in Baldwin, but they tore that down and built a regular home for her. So she moved away from there, and that's when they sold, and they subdivided the whole property and sold, and started selling, the lots. But as I understand it from my mom, my dad didn't make a dime on it. So because of the pollution and also the cost of putting in the road and everything, it just didn't work out very well for him. But I think he broke even, but I don't think he made any money on it. Quite a neat piece of property, you'd think, but that's the way it went.
Yeah. Well, it is a beautiful piece of property.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, looking south. Yeah, he picked it for that, to make sure that he could put his garden on that ridge, on the south facing.
Well, he sounds like quite a man, and certainly, like I said, people in the White Lake area still remember, Mr. McFall and what he did to at least mitigate what happened later.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Some of the relatives of the people who were for it are probably having a little smile also about how that all worked out.
Well, we've talked about kind of a silver lining. We had two chemical companies, Hooker Chemical and DuPont, that actually have lakeshore property. But for whatever reason, they didn't, for the reason that your dad was involved, for Hooker, I'm not sure about DuPont, those areas, sizable areas, were left undeveloped, whereas they may have been developed, into residence or homes. And so now those parcels are just very good fish and wildlife habitat.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
at least there are some silver linings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to say?
No, I don't think so. I think we went, I tried to just put a couple bullet points here, and I think we covered them.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do an interview with us, and appreciate knowing more about your grandfather's contribution.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
We are here today with Lee McFall. We're in Sparta at Mr. McFall's dental office, and would like to first ask if you've read and signed the legal release.
Yes, I have.
Okay, thank you. And the project is, the interview is being conducted for the White Lake Environmental History Project, and it would be helpful to start with a question as to, what's your relationship to the White Lake area?
Well, because she was a very interesting character, but they owned that property there, and that's where they lived while I was a little boy. They lived in Muskegon for a while, and they lived in Sparta for a while. But when I thought of my grandparents' house, I thought about the house on what is now called McFall Circle.
Can you tell me a little bit about your parents, their names and background a little bit?
Okay, my dad's name is Paul. He doesn't have a first name, just an initial H, which was for his mother, Henrietta. So it's H. Paul McFall, and then he married my mom. Sure was there from, say, 1950 but I was born in 1952. My sister was born in 50, and we spent our summers there until 1965.
Oh, what was your grandfather's name?
Everybody called him T.E. because those were his initials. It's Thurlow Edwin McFall, and most people called him Mac, actually. So, but T.E. was another name that they called him a lot.
And your grandmother?
Henrietta, and she was also a huge part of the family lore. But when I was a little boy, we had a cottage on the north side of White Lake, right across the street from the Hooker Chemical Company. That was my grandfather's property, really. I'm not sure how big a piece it is, but it's probably 300 feet wide by a quarter of a mile long from Old Channel Trail down to the water. And my grandfather had his home there, and then he built a cottage down on the water for my parents as a wedding present in 1949. And so that was our cottage, and we spent most of our summer with Faulkner, and then she became, of course, Shirley McFall, and they married in 49, and my sister was born in 1950. So my sister was born 9 months to the day after they got married. And and then I was born in 52. And he didn't have any other siblings. He was an only child.
So your grandparents had property on White Lake?
Yes.
And then your parents and you lived on White Lake for a time?
We were there for the summers, pretty much for the entire summer.
Okay. Do you, can you tell a little bit about your